Well, we've only got a couple of cars left to review in GT7 Spec 2, and of course this one is a big deal because even though it's technically not a returning face, because we've never actually had the 68 Charger in the game before, such as this one is, it is of course a returning legend in the general sense of a proper, classic, iconic Dodge Charger. And of course I did a video technically about this car, last week or so, which was only a couple of minutes long, had quite a lot of chatter in the comments back and forth about certain Dukes of Hazzard liveries on it. And of course you can click on that video if you haven't seen it already, but that aside, it is, even without Dukes of Hazzard, an incredibly iconic car. And to me, one of the things I really like about this era of Charger, those cars have such a nice proportion to their design, with the boot and the bonnet, or I guess the trunk and the hood, if you want to call it that, being about the same kind of proportion. So you're almost sitting in the middle of the car as the driver, and it's actually something which I really like about Abe, my 68 Lincoln Continental two-door, which has almost a Dodge Charger kind of shape to it, in a vague kind of sense, and certainly in terms of the proportions it's quite similar, because in the 70s they went to having super long bonnets and a shorter trunk, and then in the earlier 60s and some of the 50s you had the super long boot and not so much of a bonnet in comparison, whereas in the mid to late 60s there were quite a few of these cars that were pretty nicely equal from front to back. And although I haven't driven a classic Charger, so I can only speak for my Lincoln, it is a car which feels a lot better through corners, partially because of that distribution of size and weight, than it realistically should be. It shouldn't handle as well as it does, certainly in the case of a luxury Lincoln, but I'm sure the Charger is at least as good, probably better, being more of a performance car from its time. Now, of course, being a classic American car, probably the number one thing you're going to need to do to this is change the transmission, because the top speed is pathetic on these cars. I'm sure in real life it's more than enough. I mean, I never take my Lincoln, for example, up to its top speed. It can do about 120, 130, but I'm never going to be doing that in it. And technically this one can get up to a similar kind of speed, and of course their acceleration is more so what you'd be using in real life, but changing out the transmission makes such an immediate difference to any classic American car. It's ridiculous. You can turn an otherwise charming but definitely dated car, maybe even not a performance car, into a shockingly good one around the track. Because consider this one, for example. This of course is the 68 426, so it's a decent sized engine, you know, it's around a 7 litre, of course it's a HEMI, 425 horsepower, and the weight is not that bad. It's 1.8 tons, 1805 kilos, but for perspective, that's well over 100 kilos less than the Challenger Demon, so not bad for what looks like a much bigger, heavier old school car with a lot more metal and a lot less plastic than most modern cars. But just drop that 1800 kilos down a little bit, leave the power even as it already is, drop the centre of gravity, improve the brakes, and of course stretch out those gears a bit more. You've immediately got yourself a car that feels night and day, and even in terms of its performance and its capabilities against AI or other players, is a night and day difference without breaking the bank either on cash or, more importantly, on points. Because the point level on this one is quite reasonable, because of course it is older, it's bigger, it's heavier, and it's not that quick with the standard transmission, at least for top end speed. It's only 489 points, so you've got so much wiggle room there. And one of the things that you may want to look into is, for example, back in Gran Turismo 6, I used to use the 70 shape Chevy Nova quite a lot at the, I think it was 475 to about 500 point level. And one of the reasons why it was so deceptively good is because you can actually reduce the power, and because those other things like dropping the weight and extending the gears made such a drastic difference, you didn't even need the full horsepower that it started with. Likewise with this one, 425 means you could reduce it down to 400 or even less, and you've still got plenty of power, plenty of torque, and you've more than made up for it with everything else. I do believe that this is one of those cars that is most likely going to get some kind of engine swap. I mean, so many of the other muscle cars, modern and older, even the Challenger, for example, they do already have swaps. So I really do think it's a matter of time for this one. I think if I could choose, I would probably suggest having the modern Charger Hellcat engine. Of course now the Challenger Demon, I suspect, is what most players would probably want, but I feel like having the Charger to Charger would make a bit more thematic sense. And of course one final thing about this car, which I found quite interesting, is the body kit. I talked about this in my overarching thoughts of 1.40, but it has the most interesting wide body of any of these cars in terms of 1.40. because it adds quite a lot of visual flair. It adds some quite large heat ducts, if you will, coming off of the arches, both front and especially at the back. They're a lot more notable, and it's actually quite cool when the game does that, when they have this unusually detailed wide body compared to some of the others which are literally just the same thing but a bit wider. I think it's fantastic to finally have the Charger back. Of course it had to happen at some point. It's way too important of a car not to have it back, especially when you have so many others in this iconic class like your Superbirds, Camaros, Mustangs. I mean, how could you not have the Charger in there as well? So ultimately, that's it for my thoughts on this car. Great to see it back. I love the look on it. And as one final thing, one of my favourite things in racing games when it comes to graphics is when they get a really nice texture. Something which almost looks like you can actually reach out and touch it. And for me, inside the Charger, it's that front pillar. That window pillar, that texturing looks so believable. It looks so reminiscent of touching an actual classic American car that I would be driving in real life. Not a Charger, but like my Ford Galaxy or either of the Lincolns. It's so reminiscent of that kind of see it, feel it and touch it kind of old school thrift shop kind of vibe that those cars have these days. But I love that. I love that kind of attention to detail. So of course, super badass car, great to have it in the game, and technically kind of a mix of new and returning, if you want to look at it that way. So of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Are you happy to see it? Are you happy with the car? Have you maybe found a particular tune that turns it into a beast? Either way, let me know down below. And of course, with only one car remaining, it's the car that a lot of people would probably skip over, the Tesla, but I would actually recommend checking out the review because it's a pretty damn surprising car in terms of what it can do. So of course, stick around for that one, and I'll see you next time. But for now, thanks for watching.